Alhamdulillahi wahdah, wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da. All praise is due to Allah, and we send salutations and salam upon the messenger of whom none other will come after, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Berkeley, Hume, Leibniz, Descartes, Isaac Newton, Al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina al-Abhari. What do all of these names have in common? They all studied logic and philosophy. And the study of logic goes back a long way, with some of the first works being published in ancient Greece, it seems. The Isagoge. And that study of logic has reached us all the way down till today and had many commentaries written on it. And logic itself as an endeavor, as a topic within philosophy, has been refined and made easier. And it's something that's still taught today in modern books such as Volker Halbach's Logic Manual and Mark Sainsbury's book on philosophy and logic as well. So what is this endeavor? How do we go about doing philosophy? How is logic done? Well, that's what we want to examine and look into today and try to summarize some of the main and key ideas so that we can go on to further study of logic and philosophy, and that we can start evaluating all sorts of claims in our lives and people's beliefs and conclusions, and even the way things are done and whether they're done in a logical way, such as even the scientific method and whether they can yield, and why or how they can yield truth, and if it's definite or if the truth isn't definite, and how statistics even plays a place as well. So, without further ado, let us begin. So, in philosophy, particularly since the 20th century, what philosophers have been interested in is constructing something known as an argument. Now, an argument isn't a shouting match between two people. It's actually a set of, well, what you could say declarative sentences that are either true or false, with a final one which is usually marked as the conclusion and claiming that this thing must be true as a result of these other beliefs that we hold. So what are the key terms that we sort of want to understand? If we really go down to the core of it and the fundamentals, I think the most important terms to understand initially, and this isn't obviously just me, this is based on what's being taught in universities and in other places and by these authors that we've mentioned, is what an argument is, its two main features, which is validity and soundness, and finally whether it's an inductive or deductive argument, and how we go about reaching that conclusion. So these four terms are the main things that we want to try to understand today in order to understand how to go about constructing a proper argument or analyzing somebody's argument for something. So let's make a start. What is an argument? An argument is a set of premises and conclusion where the conclusion is supposed to is something that we're supposed to arrive at from our belief in the premises. So the premises are sort of there to guide us towards the conclusion, and the conclusion is usually some new information, but not always. So let's have a look at an argument in our first example. So we have two premises here. We can have any number. Socrates is a human, all humans are mortal, and we conclude something new. Socrates is mortal. Now we probably all agree with that and we understand how that's done. Our minds are sort of working it out automatically. If you want to visualize it, imagine this. Socrates is part of this circle called humans, this group. Obviously Socrates isn't every human, so he's a small member, a small dot in this big circle. This small circle is part of a bigger circle, which contains all of the small circle. This bigger circle is those creatures which are mortal, those things which are mortal, such as insects and animals as well. Those would be other circles in the big circle. So because Socrates is definitely in that circle of thing called humans, and that circle is definitely in that bigger circle of things called mortals, it follows, it must be the case that Socrates is part of the bigger circle, which is mortal creatures, and he must be contained within that, and so he himself must be mortal. That's one way to visualize it. You don't have to use that way. And our gift of rationality and logic and aql, as we would say in Arabic, means that we would come to this conclusion as a result of these premises. We would come to this new information on the basis of these two other things that we already know. Now, what we can say about some of the features and properties of these sentences are all these sentences are either true or false. They're one of two values. Socrates is Socrates a human. That phrase is either true or false. It's true if Socrates is a human, and it's false if Socrates is not a human. That seems obvious. But why do we mention that? Because in an argument, you can't have sentences which don't express something that can be true or false. So, for example, I can't have as a premise the question, how are you? Because that question in itself is not true or false. It's just a question. Or if you ask me to do something or ask you to do something such as look up is not a true or false. It's just a request that we're making of each other or a command that we're giving to each other. So it has to be something known as a declarative sentence. All the premises and conclusions have to be declarative sentences, which are sentences that are either true or false. And yeah, that probably seems quite obvious, but it's worth being clear about. What's important is to know that a similar argument can be expressed, and you can rearrange the premises slightly or change the words slightly as long as you use words with the exact same meaning, and you would reach the same conclusion. You would learn the same information. So this time we've got all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Socrates therefore must be mortal. Now, what's the difference between this and the last one? It's just that premise 1 and premise 2 have switched places. Socrates as a human is now premise 2, and all humans are mortal is now premise 1. And yet we come to exactly the same conclusion. That shouldn't be anything surprising. We could also slightly rearrange it and say all humans are creatures with lives that all humans will die eventually at some point in time. That sentence is something that's expressing something very similar to the concept of mortality, in fact identical. So you could switch that out and say all humans will eventually die. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Conclusion, Socrates will eventually die. Again, you'd be expressing the same information, but just using different words, but with the same meaning, the same semantic content. Let's look at another example. This is quite a powerful example to show us the power of logic and from going from one place to a new place. So premise 1, Socrates is a human. Premise 2, all humans are truculent. Now, I want you to just assume the premises are true. You don't even have to know what truculent means. That's actually the point. I hope you don't. What could we conclude from these premises? Take a moment and think about it. You would probably conclude Socrates must be truculent as well. Again, he's part of that circle of humans. All of that small circle of humans is part of that bigger circle of truculent creatures. And so Socrates must be contained within that bigger circle of truculent creatures, and therefore he is one. Now, we don't even know what the term, or at least I hope most of us don't know what the term truculent is. And yet we can still affirm that information, that predicate as we would call it in philosophy, that claim to Socrates. Because if we assume premise 1 and premise 2 are true, we would definitely know that the conclusion must be true. For example, if someone came to us and gave us a testimony, actually no, let's not go into that, but the point is quite clear, and that should show you the power of logic and the power of aql and the power of going from our ability as humans of using our brain and our rationality and our logic such that we can go to new places whilst we don't even completely understand the information we already have. So yes. And what does truculent actually mean? It means it's a property, and that property suggests that someone, if they have it, that they are quick to fight or get into arguments. Now, I'm sure we probably do know people who are truculent, but it's also very likely we know at least some people in our lives, and definitely historically, who are not truculent, who are very passive, who try to avoid fights and argumentation. So to claim that all humans are truculent is obviously false, because there are definitely some humans who aren't. So you can't say every human, all humans are truculent. So But the point of the argument, or at least the first property that we're trying to assess of the argument, which is validity, is not so much whether the premises or the conclusion is actually true. It's just that with validity, when we try to assess whether an argument has this property, has this feature, we just assume the premises are true and see if the conclusion comes as a result. We'll define things properly in a moment, so don't worry too much if that wasn't clear. Let's look at an argument that we might consider bad in everyday speech or everyday thought. Premise 1, all whales are mammals. Premise 2, Socrates is a mammal. Conclusion, Socrates is a whale. Now again, it doesn't matter if premise 1 is true or premise 2 is true. The question is, if they were true, would the conclusion be true as well? Well, clearly not, because Socrates is part of this big group of things called mammals. Whales are also part of this big group of things called mammals, but they're both contained within the big group of mammals, and yet they're not necessarily intersecting. Whales can be over here, a small circle, and Socrates can be over here, and yet they'd still be within this big circle of mammals. So it's possible that Socrates is a male. It's possible that all whales are mammals. But that doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't follow, it doesn't have to be the case that Socrates is a whale as a result of premise 1 and premise 2 being true. If Socrates was a whale, then we'd need more information in order to prove it, other than just premise 1 and premise 2. So what can we say from these premises? All whales are mammals and Socrates is a mammal. Well, we can't really say anything new. But what we could do is perhaps re-express the premises in the conclusion. So we're not learning anything new, but technically, from a logical standpoint, this is okay. This is valid. You can do this. If all whales are mammals and Socrates, if premise 1 says all whales are mammals and it's true, and premise 2 says Socrates is a mammal and it's true, the conclusion must be all whales are mammals and Socrates is a mammal. Nothing new, just combining the two premises. And with logical functions and operators, we can do that. And that's something that hopefully we'll explore in the near future. With logical we can also restate one of the premises into the conclusion. That would make the argument valid. So now you might be thinking, okay, what's the point of validity if it's so easy to get like this? Well, we'll see in a moment. Validity in itself is not good enough to convince somebody of a conclusion, and we'll see why that is. We can also add some random stuff into the conclusion if we add this thing called an OR function. We can say, we can restate any one of the premises, assuming the premises are true, and we can just say OR, and we can add anything, even if it's untrue. Because as long as one of the two things on the side of OR is true, then the argument is valid. Socrates is immortal, well, we know that's not true, and nothing in the premises claims that's true. So we don't even have to bother evaluating that, because we can look on the left side and we can say Socrates is a mammal, well, that's true. So technically that conclusion does follow. If you don't understand that too much, that's fine. I just wanted to bring in this niche example to show what we might examine in future videos. So let's actually go into this property of validity, back into the core understanding, the core content of today's presentation. An argument, what is the definition of validity? The definition is, an argument is valid if and only if the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Or in other words, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, it has to follow. So we're not actually interested, this is an important point, we're not actually interested in whether the premises are true, we're interested in the fact that if they were true, would the conclusion then come out, and would we then learn the new conclusion? So we go back to our old example, and it's a good example of a valid argument. Now again, what we said is premise 2 is not actually true, but if we assumed it was true, we entertained the idea that there is an imaginary world where all humans are actually too quick to fight and argue, then it would definitely be the case in that imaginary world that if Socrates is part of that group of things called humans, Socrates exists in that imaginary world as well, and he's human, then he also necessarily has to be someone who's quick to fight and argue, and so he's truculent. So we get to somewhere new from the premises we already have. Now, previously we've been using the same form. Basically, X is an A, all A's are B, therefore X is B. But can we use a different template, a different format? Of course. Take this one, for example, inspired by Descartes' famous argument, which hopefully we'll look at in the future in more depth. Premise 1, if I think, then I exist. It's an if-then sort of argument. Premise 2, I think. Conclusion, I exist. Is this valid? If premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, will the conclusion definitely be true? Let's use I, as in me, the person who's recorded this video, to be very specific about who we're referring to, because it's important to be specific in philosophy. If I think, then I exist. Well, do you think? Do I think? Okay, sorry, premise 2. We've affirmed the fact that I think. So if we have affirmed that, if we have affirmed the antecedent, then we have to affirm the consequent. We've seen two valid arguments with slightly different forms. This one and this one. If I, the author, think, or if Socrates thinks, then Socrates exists. Socrates thinks, Socrates, therefore Socrates must exist. What about some invalid examples? Well, let's go back to our original example. All whales are mammals, Socrates is a mammal, therefore Socrates is a whale. Right. So we know that there's a problem with this. You know, we know that the conclusion is false, but even if the premises were true, the conclusion would still not be true, because it says, because Socrates, there's nothing that suggests that Socrates is part of this group of things which are whales. If we wanted to make it valid, we would have to add some more premises, such as we could add a new premise, premise 3, mammals, all mammals are whales. And then we would conclude Socrates is a whale. That would be valid. But we don't have that premise, and we're not going to add it in. So the argument remains invalid. Let's look at example 4. All females are mortal, Socrates is a human, Socrates is a mortal. Now this is a very interesting example, because it's not valid, it's invalid. And yet every single thing mentioned in the example, premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion, all of those are true statements. Are all females mortal? Yes. Is Socrates a human? Yes. Is Socrates a mortal? Is Socrates a mortal? Yes, he is. And yet the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Why? Because we've not said anything about humans being mortal. We've said all females are mortal, but females, we've not even said that they're human. And even if we said females are human, which they obviously are, that doesn't mean Socrates is a female, and so that doesn't mean Socrates is mortal. So again, all of these are true premise, all of these are true statements, but they're not linked to one another. They're not related. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. The premises do not lead us to the conclusion. Rather, they're all separate. They're all just separate facts. So that's invalid. Why is that important? Because sometimes in life, we could have a bunch of valid claims. We could have a bunch of true statements that we're trying to tell somebody, and yet they're not related. Where we're trying to go from, the things that I've said to you, the claims I've made, let's say I really want to convince you that Socrates is mortal. If I give you premise 1 and premise 2, and then I give you the conclusion, you could say to me, well, your argument doesn't follow. Yeah, you may be right, but you've not proved it to me. Your conclusion doesn't follow from your premises. Obviously, somebody will probably believe the conclusion anyway, because they'll already be aware of the fact that Socrates is a human, or humans are mortal, but you've not expressed it. So you've not given them enough reason from the point of logical arguments, from the point of valid arguments and sound arguments to convince them. So again, let's look at an example where things go wrong. Now, there are things called fallacies, and these are committed when you basically go from premises to conclusion incorrectly. So when we look at these premises, premise 1 and premise 2, we still can't reach the conclusion. Premise 1, if I think, then I exist. Let's say me, the author. Premise 2, I exist. Conclusion, I think. But that doesn't necessarily work. Why? Because you're affirming the first term, thinking. You're affirming the claim thinking from the basis of existing. And yet it's possible something could exist and yet not think. Take a stone, for example. Take an inanimate object, for example. It doesn't think like us. It couldn't understand probably logical inferences, the things, or any of the stuff we've been discussing today. So this doesn't work. Why? Because even if premise 1 is true, which it is, and even if premise 2 is true, which it is, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow, because we can use examples to show it doesn't work. Take a stone again. If a stone thinks, then a stone exists. That's true. That would be true. Assume that's true. Premise 2, a stone exists. Assume that's true. Not hard to assume, because there are stones outside that actually exist. Conclusion, the stone thinks. Not necessarily, because the stone can exist without thinking. So again, let's think about the circles again. There's this big circle of existent things. There is another small circle inside of it, which are thinking things, because all thinking things exist. And yet there are also other places inside that big circle, such as non-thinking things, things that don't think, which is separate to this thinking things circle, and a stone would be in the non-thinking things circle. So this doesn't follow. The stone would not be part of that other circle. Don't worry if that's not too clear. We'll go into that in more depth in the future. And finally, our own arguments and this concept of assumptions, because this is something we need to sort of fix. And this is often why a lot of people who try to convince one another don't manage to do so. Assumptions are basically hidden premises. They are premises that are not stated in an argument, but if they were, they would probably lead to the conclusion being true. If these assumptions were actually fleshed out, if they were brought into the argument. So let's look at this example of an argument. Zeno is a tortoise, therefore Zeno is toothless. Now, if you're a biologist, or have good knowledge of tortoises, you know that tortoises don't have teeth. But most people don't know that. At least some people don't know that. So you can't say, just because I tell you, if I'm trying to convince you and you didn't know that before, and I say, oh, by the way, I've got a pet called Zeno, and you say, oh, okay, and I say, so, and you say, and you ask me, for example, does he have nice teeth? And I say to you, no, of course he doesn't, because he's a tortoise. No, sorry, of course he doesn't. You might be wondering, why doesn't he have teeth? Did he lose his teeth? What happened to them? Then I try to convince you that he's toothless. Now, you'd probably just believe me. But what could we add in there to flesh out the fact that Zeno must definitely be toothless? What do we have to add in there in order to go from the premises to the conclusion, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true? Because right now all we've said in the premises is Zeno is a tortoise. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Zeno has to be toothless. Very simple, we just add a new premise. We say all tortoises are toothless, we bring in this new fact. And then if the premises are true, which in this case is now premise 1 and premise 2, the conclusion has to be true. There's no way it can be false. And finally, one thing we want to avoid in valid arguments is ambiguity. So if we say all of Ahmed's hamsters are sat on a bank, let's say he's got a lot of pet hamsters, and then we say premise 2, Ahmed is sat with his hamsters, conclusion, and then we try to get some new information from this, Ahmed is sat on top of a financial institution, it doesn't follow, necessarily. Why? Because a bank in the English language can mean multiple things, just as other words in other languages can mean multiple things. A bank could be a financial institution, but a bank could also be that thing that's on the side of a river, that's next to a riverbank. So this hamsters could be sat based on the information and premises we've been given on the bank by the river, or they could be sat on top of the financial institution. And so because we don't know which one, it doesn't mean that the conclusion definitely follows from the premises. So we want to fix that in order to make sure we have a clearly valid argument. Okay, Now onto the concept of deductive validity and inductive validity. So what have we really gone through, or what do we want to remember so far? We really just want to remember what is validity and what is an argument. And I'm sure we all remember what it is. An argument is a set of premises where the conclusion follows from the premises. Where an argument is a set of premises and a conclusion where the premises are meant to support the conclusion. And a valid argument is one where that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. But in everyday life, we actually usually have degrees of probability involved. So we have a deductively valid argument, which is what we've defined before. The conclusion has to follow from the premises. But an inductively valid argument is one where the conclusion probably follows from the premises, but it's not definite. Again, this definition is slightly more controversial amongst philosophers, but we're going to use it for the sake of ease, and it will allow us to do philosophy, I think, quite well. So let's look at the difference between these two. The first one is a deductively valid argument, and the second one is an inductively valid argument. If something thinks it must exist, I, the author, think, therefore I exist. We can all agree that's true. Because if I'm fulfilling that first condition of thinking, then I have to be doing that second thing of existing. But what about the next example? All crows that have been observed and seen, whether that be by the average layperson or a scientist or examined in a lab, have all been black. And in fact, that's actually true. So nothing controversial about that. Conclusion: the next crow that will be observed will be black. Now, does the conclusion have to follow from this premise? If the premise is true, is the conclusion definitely true? We would probably say in this case that no. It's possible that there is a white crow out there. It's possible that there is a rare pigmentation disease in the future such that crows may change color from black to something else. So we can't definitely say that the next crow will be black, but can we say it with a high degree of confidence and belief? Probably yes. And probably everyone you if you were to tell anyone that, we've observed these number of crows, thousands of crows, and every crow we've ever observed has always been black, and all of these 3,000 crows are black, they will probably come to the conclusion that, okay, fine, the next crow that I see will probably be black, or maybe their whole species, all of the crows are black in general. Generally speaking, we accept this and we use these inferences in everyday life. We use these arguments in everyday life, whether we acknowledge it consciously or not, and it's a fine way of doing things. It's not as good or as strong as deductive validity, but inductive validity, which is what we're using in example 6, is still a very good method. Now, the final concept I want to focus on today, soundness. Now, a lot of you may have already had issues with valid arguments. You might think, well, we still can't say valid arguments are good because you could have any number of weird premises that we don't know are true or false, and yet because we assume they're true, the conclusion must follow, and the conclusion will be true if the premises are true. But that doesn't even mean the conclusion is true, because we don't even know that the premises are true in the first place. So we could still have a false conclusion and a false belief. Exactly, that's correct. That's why what we're actually looking for is sound arguments. And what is the definition of sound arguments? They're arguments that are sound. An argument is sound if and only if. The only way it can be sound is the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and the premises are actually true. So it's basically the definition of soundness is the definition of validity plus one more thing, that the premises are actually true, and so the conclusion is definitely true. So now this should highlight why validity was important in the first place, because in order to get soundness, we need to already have validity, and then we can go about trying to evaluate whether the premises are true, so that we can figure out whether the conclusion is true. So let's go to an example that's actually sound. If something thinks it must exist, we're all agreed that's true. I don't think anyone would disagree and say, no, there are things that think that aren't existent. No, because if something doesn't, if something doesn't think, sorry, if there is a non-existent thing, that thing cannot think. So that would not work. There's no way. No one, I don't think anyone would believe that nothing, literally nothing, can actually think. That would be a crazy, absurd belief. So if something thinks, it must exist. I'm sure we're all agreed with that. Premise 2, I, the author, think. I hope you can agree with that and you don't think I'm some random AI bot or something. I am actually a person, the author, and I'm sure you can believe and are confident in the fact that I think. And so it must follow that I, the author of this video, exist. That's a sound argument. Why? Because the conclusion definitely follows from the premises, so it's valid, and the premises are actually true, so it's sound, and that means the conclusion has to be true. So this is what we're actually aiming for in life, to convince people, sound arguments. Let's look at a sound argument versus an argument that's valid but not sound. Well, again, back to the example we just used, that's a sound argument. What's the other example? It's one we looked at earlier as well. Socrates is a human, or humans are truculent. Socrates is truculent. Now here, in actual real life, in our reality, we know all humans aren't truculent. I'm sure we've all come across someone who's calm and patient, passive, someone who doesn't like to get into arguments or fights. And there are definitely at least some historical figures. So they are humans who aren't truculent. Therefore, all humans cannot be truculent, all humans are not truculent, and premise 2 is false. So, the argument is unsound. Yes, the conclusion follows from the premises. Socrates would be truculent if the premises were true, but the reality is premise 2 is not true, and so the conclusion is not true. And so it's unsound, and we cannot form the belief that Socrates is truculent. It's only sound arguments that should give us real reason to believe in the conclusion. And there's just a diagrammatic example. The arrows suggest that the conclusion flows from the premises, which they do in both cases, but again, premise 2 is actually false, so we've highlighted it in red, and so the argument is unsound, and we have no reason to believe in the conclusion, which in this case is Zaid. We're using the name Zaid now. You can use Zaid or Socrates, etc. So let's summarize everything. Today we defined what an argument was. We looked into its two main properties, validity and soundness. And we also considered how different types of inference, different types of arguments, deductive ones and inductive ones. Deductive ones are ones where the conclusion definitely follows from the premises, and inductive arguments are ones where the conclusion probably, with a good chance, over 50% flows from the premises. Now we can start to use these tools to better analyze claims by thinking about our everyday beliefs and putting them into argument form. When we try to convince somebody in an essay or by talking to them, we flesh out our assumptions. We don't, lack detail. We mention everything that's relevant in order for somebody to reach the final thing that we're trying to convince them of, the conclusion. And why is this all important? Because in reality, there is often disagreement between philosophers when it comes to the truth of actual premises and the soundness of an actual argument. But all philosophers would agree, at least probably, on whether an argument is valid. So this is important because as long as we can first establish validity using our logical tools, of which we still need to refine more in hopefully other videos, then we can finish on that endeavor. We can agree as rational, logical human beings that the argument is valid, and then the only thing left to do is just to assess whether the premises are true. And that we do through various different methods, and that's something we'll cover in other videos and in the near future. Sometimes we can just assess it straight away from the basic facts that we know through our life experiences. But again, we'll leave that for another video. So thank you for joining me. After this video, I hope to go into some very important arguments, and also to go into those arguments with other philosophers and experts and academics and everyday people as well. And lastly, we want to and hopefully after this video we'll also have a short series on refining our logic and our skills in logic, so that we can properly assess whether all these different types of arguments are valid or invalid. And so then the only thing left for us to do is just to determine soundness. But now we know what these definitions are, we know what we're looking for. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All mistakes are from myself, and I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for anything correct that was said and any beneficial knowledge that was transmitted and that was gained. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah ya ahli. May the peace and mercy of Allah be upon you, my family.